Hey everybody, welcome to week 4. As you'll remember, last week we talked about some of the legacies of the French Revolution, including the idea that the French Revolution created a frame of reference for future politics, future political movements, that future isms, right, that's like widespread political ideologies that end in ism, Romanticism, Liberalism, Conservatism, gain their meaning from their interpretations of the French Revolution. So this week we're going to dive into each of those ideologies, and we're going to discuss the three major isms of the early 19th century: conservatism, liberalism, and romanticism. So let's start with conservatism. Obviously, we all have at least a rough definition of what conservatism means, but that's probably based on our interpretations of current events or the world that we grew up in here in the US. So I'd like you to try and put that aside if you can for just a little while today and try to think historically about conservatism in the early 19th century, what it was all about, how it interpreted the French Revolution, why it developed when it did. Okay, so let's think about some basic definitions. By conservatism, what I mean is a worldview or an outlook that valued traditional institutions and sought to conserve them, sought to protect them. It's no accident that conservatism emerged when it did. The news of the French Revolution horrified the traditional ruling classes of Europe. The revolution inspired fears that uprisings would spread, that the French might even invade and bring the revolution to new countries, as Napoleon actually did in some cases. And the most prominent voice for these fears was an Englishman, Edmund Burke. Burke had actually been a supporter of the American revolutionaries in the 1770s, their calls for against, that is, taxation without representation. Burke was an opponent of the slave trade, and as he put it, he was a passionate supporter of liberty. Okay, so there's Edmund Burke. But these same arguments that he had used in support of the American Revolution were basically the crux of his argument against the French Revolution in the 1790s. What Burke argued was that the French Revolution didn't represent liberty at all, right? It was simply chaos that would lead to terror and dictatorship. And I want to be clear, it's probably easy for someone to make those arguments in, say, 1793 or 94 in the midst of the reign of terror. But Burke was actually making these claims early. He was saying these things in 1789, 1790, right, during the early moderate phase of the revolution. The problem that Burke identified, the problem as Burke understood it, was that French revolutionaries were guided by abstract ideas. Liberty, equality, fraternity, to him, weren't very meaningful unless they were grounded in something specific. And he didn't see anything specific in the French Revolution. There was no history. There was no human experience as he understood it. The revolutionaries were undermining traditional authority. They were undermining the belief in God. But then they had nowhere to go from there. So he saw the French Revolution as a purely destructive movement with no clear goal. And for many conservatives, it's not just the revolution that's to blame, right? It's actually the Enlightenment as well. For many conservative thinkers, it's the philosophes of the Enlightenment who had eroded confidence in authority and made the revolution possible in the first place. Let's go through a few key differences between the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. And when I say the Enlightenment here, I think we can make some assumptions about sort of basic connections to revolutionary thought, including early revolutionary thought, things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the basic framework of that early National Assembly. Okay, these are the ideals that are guiding that early phase of the revolution. And we could also say, to some extent, guiding later radical phases. Remember the relationship between Rousseau and Robespierre that we talked about. Robespierre, obviously the famous radical Jacobin leader who was so deeply influenced by Rousseau's idea of a social contract. So we see Enlightenment ideas all through the revolution. So when conservatives are challenging the Enlightenment, they're also challenging the revolution. Okay. Enlightenment thinkers, as we talked about, they prioritized humankind's inherent rationality. But conservative thinkers argued that there's no reason to have faith in human reason. Right? The great mass of humanity had certainly built an impressive amount of knowledge that they could draw from, but individuals themselves were not particularly rational. Right? The French Revolution illustrated this. Where was the reason, after all, in executing thousands upon the mere suspicion of their disloyalty? Where was the reason in emphasizing loyalty above all else? Likewise, Enlightenment thinkers admired the good of human nature, and they claimed that evil was a consequence of social conditions. Right? If someone does something wrong, if someone commits some act against society, it's because something had happened to them, right? Enlightenment thinkers would say, how can we identify what those causes are? Conservatives didn't agree with that. They would say human wickedness is at the core of human nature, that humans are by their very nature evil. And they defended this argument by reference to Christian teachings. Think about the story of Adam and Eve, right? There's a corrupted nature in all of us. And it's not our nature, our good nature, that's going to make us behave. It's external institutions that are going to make us behave. It's law, it's authority, it's tradition. Those are the things that will check our evil instincts, our natural evil instincts, and keep peace, keep order. And again, they point to the French Revolution. Look what happens when you pull back the order of the society. Right? This is what will result. Okay. Without church, without social hierarchies like the estate system, without a king, this is what you get: chaos, savagery. Another difference is Enlightenment thinkers revered the possibility of the unknown. They revered the idea of discovery. They were always in search of a greater truth. Do you remember Kant's great call to dare to know, right? That's an essential Enlightenment ideal. Conservatives revered the wisdom of tradition. They revered the wisdom of the past. The great truths of humanity weren't waiting to be discovered. They were already known, and they just had to be followed. Existing institutions promoted that wisdom. The church promoted wisdom. Monarchies promoted wisdom. Popular common morality promoted wisdom. Those are the things that held up society. And before you go tearing them down, this is what Burke would argue, you had better proceed with infinite caution. No change is worth challenging established historical institutions, unless you are really, really sure. And he would have doubted that anyone was really sure. Okay. So what I've just talked about is sort of the basic intellectual framework of conservatism, what conservative thinkers believed, how they came to those conclusions, how they developed in the midst of Enlightenment and Revolution. But it's not just an intellectual movement, right? It's not just thinkers writing their ideas down. Conservatism in the early 19th century is also a political movement. Okay. Consider, for example, the Austrian diplomat Prince Clemens von Metternich, who is the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire. He's one of the most influential people in Europe in the early 19th century. This is in the age of Napoleon and after. And he's really responsible for building the multinational coalition that defeated Napoleon, finally exiled him out of Europe for good, and then created a new international order to maintain peace and stability in Europe afterwards. And Metternich was an arch conservative. Okay, so not only one of the most important politicians in Europe, but a deeply, deeply ideological conservative. What did he believe? Well, it's very similar to what Burke would have claimed, right? He believed that monarchy and hierarchy guaranteed stability and order. He hated revolution. The ideals of liberty and equality, so basic to revolutionary principles, for him they equaled war, they equaled terror, disruption. Okay. And it's important when we think about a figure like Metternich, when we think about any political figure, it's important to think about the context of that person's own life, right? What was happening in Metternich's time that would make him think the things he did? So obviously there's a reaction to the French Revolution, but there's also his own empire that we need to think about, right? The Austrian Empire. Why would the foreign minister, one of the leading figures in that empire, be so fervently anti-revolutionary? Well, one reason is that that empire was amazingly diverse. So it was amazingly vulnerable to revolution. Okay, it was home to dozens of different ethnic groups who did not have their own nations, their own homelands that they governed. Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Magyars, Poles, Romanians, Croats, right? In the world that we all live in today, each of those ethnic groups has its own homeland. Italy, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Croatia, right? That was not the case, and lands from all of those contemporary nations were part of the Austrian Empire. So there's also an extremely diverse religious culture in the Austrian Empire. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Muslims, Jews, all varieties of Protestantism are within this empire. Metternich sees this situation and recognizes that any one of these groups could try to foment a rebellion against his government. So he is uniquely threatened by revolution and uniquely concerned with preserving the old order of power in Europe. He called revolution a disease, and in response to it, he proposed two key solutions. Okay, the first one was strict oversight at home of the population. Censorship, strong internal policing, anything that could persecute revolutionaries and stop the flow of dangerous ideas into the population. Okay, so conservatives are generally opposed to widespread education. They're not terribly welcoming to the idea of widespread literacy. They're not terribly open to the idea of widespread ownership of weapons, anything that could potentially challenge established authority. And the second solution that Metternich lands on is diplomatic cooperation, right? No established power in Europe should go it alone. They should recognize that they have a common threat in revolution, and they should work together to balance power to stabilize the entire continent. If a revolution's a disease, as Metternich understood it, that means it can spread. So a revolution anywhere could lead to revolution at home. So they have to kind of work together. Okay. That second goal there, the working together of nations, that's really the purpose of the Congress of Vienna, which is held in 1814 and 1815. This is at the close of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon did, he had been expelled from Europe. He did come back for a brief period called the 100 Days at this time, but then he was expelled again. So this is the end we could say, of the uproar of the French Revolution across Europe. And this is the period where major European powers are sort of reasserting control over the whole continent. What are those powers? They're Austria, Russia, Prussia, Great Britain, and then later France as well, right? These powers come together and they reestablish the French monarchy, and all of these monarchies are going to work together to maintain the peace. The Congress of Vienna was conservative by its very nature. It was an attempt to restore not only the peace and stability of the whole continent, but those basic social differences of the old regime in France. Hierarchy, class difference, any sort of foundational inequality that maintained order in the society. And as part of this, they agree to restore monarchs to their rightful thrones, right? Rightful as in the idea that certain families, certain bloodlines have a birthright to rule. And it is a mistake to knock them out of power. So when they fall out of power, they are still the rightful heirs to the throne. That means reestablishing the French monarchy, as I said a moment ago. So 20 years after Louis is executed in 1793, his brother, Louis the 18th, ascends to the throne. Louis the 17th was a small child. He died during the Revolution. I'm not going to go into why royalists accept that he was the king, but so that's why the new king is Louis the 18th. Not important. Okay. Also central to the idea of the Congress is this idea of the balance of power, which I mentioned just a moment ago. Because all rulers are the rightful heirs to their throne, no single power should challenge another. They should protect each other. Okay, and that means help one another suppress revolutions, help one another stay in power. And in large part because of these agreements, there's no major war in Europe for about 40 years, till the 1850s, the Crimean War. So we can see from one perspective, the early 19th century is an age of conservatism. It's a conservative reaction to the age of revolution. Okay. But conservatives were not alone in this period. There's another ideology taking shape as well, and that's liberalism. Okay. So liberals, they approached the problem of revolution very differently than conservatives did. They believed that people like Metternich, people like Burke, and other conservatives, they had their heads in the sand. From the liberal perspective, there was no putting the genie back into the bottle. As it is, liberals are the ones who sort of perpetuate the ideals of 1789 into the 19th century. So what was liberalism? First, it's primarily a bourgeois ideology. The bourgeoisie, that is the propertied middle classes are the people who subscribe to to liberalism. Second, liberalism took its cues from the Enlightenment, where conservatives saw the Enlightenment as a great evil, as a corruption. Liberals promoted its emphasis on reason, its emphasis on progress. They believed in these things. They believed that reason and progress had a clear direction, that they would lead to greater and greater individual freedom, greater and greater individual rights, a more and more rational society. Liberals despised the tyranny of external power. So that means while conservatives really liked the idea of strong church and government, liberals did not. Right? They saw those as coercions. They saw those as infringements on individual rights. And there should be no arbitrary political barriers to impede any individual's ability to rise to based on their own merits. Okay, so this last point's really essential. Where conservatism emphasized tradition and authority, liberalism emphasized individual liberty. That's the core idea. Any tradition or authority that challenged individual liberty had to go. Okay, take John Stuart Mill for a second. John Stuart Mill is an English philosopher. He's probably the most famous liberal theorist of the 19th century, perhaps the most famous liberal theorist ever. And in his most prominent treatise called On Liberty, Mill claimed, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community is to prevent harm to others. That's sort of a fancy way of saying something that a lot of people would say today as well, right? An individual's rights extend only so far as they can go without limiting the rights of another individual. Okay. If you think back to last week, in the last couple of weeks actually, to our discussions of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, right? That essential document of 1789, that essential document of the French Revolution, you're going to notice a great deal of overlap between that and the sort of basic principles of liberalism, what John Stuart Mill is talking about here. That moderate phase of the French Revolution, we could call that pretty fairly a liberal phase, right? It's directed by the bourgeoisie. It's concerned primarily with individual liberty above all else. It's concerned with checking the power of government, but not erasing the power of government. And it was that phase for many liberals in the 19th century, that moderate phase from about 1789 up until part of 1792, the early part of 1792, that they wanted to get back to. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about liberals and government, liberals and the state. So, like the revolutionaries of 1789, liberals believed the state could exist for the good of all. And again, let's go back to John Locke, Montesquieu, Diderot, all of those Enlightenment thinkers we talked about a couple weeks ago. This is their basic principle of the state. Government exists to serve the people, the masses. Any government that attempts to preserve special privileges for the few is infringing on the rights of the rest. It's therefore tyrannical. It's therefore arbitrary, and it is illiberal, right? And that could apply to the old regime, the monarchies, the conservative governments. But as liberals learned in the 1790s, it could also apply to a revolutionary government that was too enamored with its own causes. So we see that with the Reign of Terror, right? There is a government that no longer protects or respects the rights of individuals, and it is instead using great violence to get its way. So liberals in the 19th century, what they concluded was that elected representative governments were best. The power should be distributed among equal branches, right? This is the idea of Montesquieu that we read. This is a key idea of the American Constitution movement throughout the American Revolution and up to the late 1780s. And these governments must spell out individual rights. So government must establish what the key individual rights are and then work to protect them. What are some of those rights? There's a right to a free press, right to free speech, right to or from religion, right to property, right to make money. That last idea is really crucial. Liberals cherish the idea of a free market, an economic sphere that government does not intervene in, where individuals are free to enter, make contracts, pursue profit, sell their goods, sell their labor, and grow a deal of the free market. And I want to be clear, that's a problematic concept. It's a concept that takes for granted that everybody is basically equal all the time, which is obviously not true. And liberals will spend roughly the next 200 years after this, up until right now, even in our presidential election right now, trying to defend this concept of a free market. And we'll come back to this idea throughout the course as well. Okay. Liberals cherished the idea of individual rights, but they also feared the masses. And that was a lesson that they learned from the Reign of Terror, as I mentioned before. So they wanted, in order to check the power of the masses, they wanted to ensure that educated and propertied people, right, people of a certain class, that is the bourgeoisie, the educated middle class, that they're the ones who come to power, that they're the ones who make the decisions. And so most liberal states in this period have some form of property requirements on voting. So there are elections, but most men are barred from those elections. All women are barred from those elections. People of color are barred from the elections. And we talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago as well. All of that is sort of a way of saying liberals demand a society of freedom and equality, but they only trust themselves to achieve that society. And they're extremely distrustful of others, the poor masses or the super elite, the landed nobles of the old regime, to work towards that society. So this is an inclusive ideology, but it's also an exclusive ideology. Liberalism is full of contradictions in this way. Liberal individualism could also be a moralistic and very punishing ideology. If one person is responsible for their own success, that also means that the unsuccessful are responsible for their miseries, right? Many liberals certainly agreed with that basic formulation. Poverty, they claimed, was a moral failing. Drunkenness, a moral failing. Starvation, a moral failing, right? And if the state, the government, tried to intervene in any of these problems, then it would be rewarding failure. It would be providing a benefit to someone who didn't deserve it, right? That would be tyranny. That would be Jacobinism. And a reign of terror would follow, surely. Let's take, for example, the very prominent historian and cleric Thomas Malthus. Okay, one of the kind of most important foundational thinkers of 19th century liberalism. Here's what Malthus wrote. When the wages of labor are barely sufficient to maintain 2 children, a man marries and has 5 or 6. He, of course, finds himself miserably distressed. He accuses his parish. He accuses the avarice of the rich. He accuses the unjust institutions of society. The last person, and here Malthus is obviously is mocking such a person, the last person he would think of accusing is himself, right? The individual in a liberal society is free, but the liberal mandate is that individual is also responsible for their own success, responsible for their own failures, their own suffering. And what Malthus is really talking about here, and what a lot of liberals were really concerned with, was self-discipline. Self-discipline is an essential component of the liberal ideology. If conservatives, here's a good contrast for you, if conservatives believed that people must be controlled by strong external authorities because they are essentially wicked, right? Liberals believed, well, people are essentially good, but that means they have to be self-disciplined. They have to control themselves. So discipline is internal in the liberal society and external in the conservative society. Of course, this emphasis on discipline aligns as well with the ethos of the free market, right? Many liberals are part of this burgeoning capitalist class, they're industrialists, they're business people. And that means they require labor to be disciplined, the labor that they hire. So it makes sense that they'd be this concerned with self-discipline. Discipline would mean faithful, dependable labor. It would mean workers who arrive on time, who don't get drunk at work, who don't waste their wages and ask for higher wages. This is the sort of mindset of liberal self-discipline. If you're trying to sort of personify this, think about the character of Ebenezer Scrooge from Charles Dickens. Right, the Scrooge character is sort of a classic 19th century liberal in that he has very little concern for the welfare of others because it's up to them. It's up to their own discipline. And he's not responsible. Okay, so that's sort of an extreme example, but that's clearly what Dickens had in mind when he created that character. And it wasn't necessarily all that different from the reality. Let's think about liberalism as a form of governance. I think the best example of this is the British government's response to the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. So the British Parliament is one of the great liberal institutions of the 19th century. Unlike today, Ireland was a colony of Great Britain. It was a restless colony. It was a troublesome colony. It was also a predominantly Catholic colony to the Protestant majority in Great Britain. In the 1840s, a blight struck the Irish potato crop. Most Irish people were peasants. They were attached to the land, and like peasants all around the world, they depended on a staple food supply, a carbohydrate, right? And in Ireland, that carbohydrate was potatoes. And because they were dependent on it, when the food supply disappeared, people began to starve. Okay, between 1845 and 1849, about 1.5 million people in Ireland died of starvation or of disease brought on by that starvation. And then 1 million more left, emigrated, went to predominantly the United States, some went to Great Britain, to Australia, etc. Here are some contemporary depictions of the potato famine. This is a mural in Belfast today. Although Belfast is in Northern Ireland, and the famine was most extreme in the southern, predominantly Catholic part of the island. So the British Parliament was a body composed of both liberals and conservatives, but it really held fast to liberal ideals of self-discipline, self-determination, individualism. And so there's no response. Okay, this is a colony under the power of Great Britain, and they do nothing. Liberals argue that intervention, in fact, would create greater economic dependence. It would teach the Irish to be undisciplined. It would teach them that they didn't have to work anymore, that they could rely on Britain to feed them. And the famine, and this is really Thomas Malthus at his most basic, his sort of philosophy, right? The famine was simply nature's way of dealing with excessive population. Okay, as a result, 1 in every 4 Irish men, women, and children die or leave the country. The country's population declines by 25% in 4 years. So it's a staggering effect of, staggering consequence of liberal governance. Not all liberals agreed with the extremes of this ideology. And what we see by mid-century is a growing sense that you can have a kind of conscience, that you can care about the welfare of others and maintain a sort of liberal individualist philosophy. John Stuart Mill, who I quoted before, believed that the state could intervene to actually expand individual liberty, that if the state took care of certain parts of life, freedom would grow, right? How would that happen? Well, people will become happier, they'll become more productive if they have an education. If you limit the number of work hours in a day from, say, 16 to 8, if the state clears the streets of filth and pollution, others adopt this sort of humane form of liberalism as well. L.T. Hobhouse, who we read this week briefly, and others, they're advocating what they call social liberalism, right? So they believe in the market, right? They believe in individuals going on the market, buying, selling, etc., making their own way. They believe in private property. They believe in individual liberty, but they also see the limits of those liberties. Those things aren't enough to promote human happiness, is what they would argue. Here's what a man named Thomas Hill Green, one of these social liberals, says. A man who possesses nothing but the powers of his labor, and who has to sell those powers to a capitalist for bare daily maintenance, might as well be denied rights of property altogether, right? You can sort of emphasize and celebrate the sort of concept of private property as much as you want. In real life, it means essentially nothing if most people have no access to it, right? It's just an idea. But if the state intervenes in certain key ways, perhaps it's not just an idea. Perhaps other people can have access to it. That's what these social liberals are saying. They're arguing, I guess, for an equality of opportunity. Give people a better chance to achieve these things. Then they can actually rely on their merits. Then they don't have to worry about starvation. Like conservatism, like sort of classic liberalism, this social liberalism was a reaction to real historical events. It was a reaction, it was an outgrowth of the French Revolution, but it was also a response to the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to come back to the Industrial Revolution very soon in much greater detail. But what we'll see is that the Industrial Revolution is creating a great deal of opportunity. It's creating a great deal of wealth. And it's also creating profound social dislocation, profound human suffering. And social liberalism is an attempt to balance those two things, the opportunity and the suffering, and try to find some middle ground. Okay, one more ism. Let's talk about Romanticism. The last two ideologies we talked about were highly political. Romanticism, I guess we could call this more of a cultural ideology. Okay, it's the dominant sort of aesthetic approach of the arts in the early 19th century. Romantic music, romantic prose, drama, poetry, painting. Each of these things is posing a sort of new perception, a new vision of the human experience, of human culture. I think we're all probably pretty familiar with major romantic artists, the English poets and novelist Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Byron, Blake, the Russian writers Pushkin, the famous composers Beethoven, Chopin. These people are kind of all over the map politically. There is no sort of single political attachment related to Romanticism, right? They can be revolutionaries, they can be liberals, they can be conservatives. Some of them change from one camp to another several times in their lives. Beethoven is a good example of this. But what united them was an emphasis on emotion, on passion, on human feeling, as the German Romantics called this Sturm und Drang, right? Emotion. That's the thing. Not analysis, right? Storm and stress, passion. This is a deliberate difference from the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment valued, as I was saying just earlier in this lecture, rationality and poise and restraint, okay? This is like a generational revolt. Think about the relationship between millennials and baby boomers that's always in the news. And you'll get a sense of how romantics and Enlightenment thinkers related to one another. The romantics were children of the revolution, but they were explicitly not children of the Enlightenment. Okay, according to romantic theorists, the philosophers had focused way too much on man's rational capacities. And in the process, they'd reduced human beings into soulless thinking machines. Enlightenment people had no creativity. They had no spontaneity. They had no imagination. And romantics were not content with that. They wanted to feel. They wanted to experience. As John Keats put it, oh, for a life of sensations rather than thoughts. William Blake, even more forceful in his poem, Milton, which we read this week. The reasoning power in man is an incrustation, right? A scab over my immortal spirit. Perhaps most famous of the Enlightenment criticism is Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, a book I'm sure many of you have read or at least familiar with, a book that warns against hubris, social engineering, the egotism of rationality, and the failure to recognize the importance of your emotional self, right? You'll notice the famous romantics that I'm talking about here, they're all artists. And that's another contrast with the Enlightenment. When we talked about the Enlightenment, we talked a lot about these theorists, these essayists, right? The people who were in the salons were not artists. But the key figures of Romanticism are, right? They're concerned with touching people's deep emotional selves, not appealing to their brains. Okay. Let's consider, just as an example of this, romantic painting, right? Look at, we didn't talk about this during the Enlightenment section, but there are sort of aesthetics of the Enlightenment, and they're usually very rational, very orderly. Look at the gardens of Versailles, and everything is sort of geometric, right? The aesthetic of romantic painting is explicitly not that. It's explicitly not geometric and orderly. Okay, let's consider the German painter Caspar David Friedrich describing how he painted. Okay, he said, the artist should not only paint what he sees in front of him, but also what he sees inside of himself. Okay, there's an internalization here. Look inside yourself. This is not an Enlightenment approach to painting. And that approach is very clear. This is Friedrich's most famous painting here, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. And it just blows up the classical landscape style, right? This is a landscape that's not orderly at all. Nature's not at rest. It's not under the control of man. It's not rational. It's in a state of fury. There's swirling clouds and fog. There's ruggedness. There's danger. And most importantly, it's visible through the artist's very literal perspective. It's subjective, in a sense. So it's not that the Romantics somehow discovered nature. Instead, they drew inspiration from it, right? Nature, because it has a lack of human intervention, a lack of clear order and reason, not only challenges Enlightenment philosophy, but it also forces us to consider what else we don't have control over, our emotional selves. Did any of this matter for politics? Is this just art? Is it just an aesthetic, which is a lot, which is great? I think it did. And we're going to talk about this in just a couple of weeks as well. But Romanticism does have a pretty profound effect on politics all throughout Europe in the 19th century. Romantics believed that just like individual people, nations had souls. Nations were unique. They were essential. Now, those souls are essential. They live in, that soul lives inside the people of the nation, and it is in their relationship to the land. And that feeling, as we see, combines with the revolutionary mentality to spark a series of nationalist uprisings throughout the 19th into the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's still an important part of global politics. And that romantic idea of a national connection to place is going to be part of that. It's never truly ended. Okay, so those are the isms. These are the politics and the aesthetics inspired by the French Revolution. As always, we'll look forward to discussing all of this with you this week. Thanks for watching.